Hello everybody, and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master Dave Vigorito, and today we're going to continue looking at some double king pawn stuff, one e4, e5 for black. And we have previously looked at some miscellaneous lines as well as like the four knights and the Italian game. And today we're going to start looking at probably white's second most dangerous option after the Ruy Lopez, and that is the Scotch opening, which starts e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4. Now this is probably the only other system for white that really has any promise. Kasparov even said once that it was the only real alternative to the Ruy Lopez where white had any chance to get any positional pressure. And this is true, and I think at like a lower level, the Scotch would actually be a very good weapon for white. Generally in the Scotch, there's two different main lines for black. One is knight f6, and then knight c3 would transpose to a four knights line. But the main line is knight takes c6, bc, e5, and now the main continuation is queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4. And this is kind of a strange position that's kind of hard to conceptualize. Both sides have been kind of inconvenienced with their queens blocking in their king's bishop. So this line I think is kind of hard to understand, even for me. Now the other main line is bishop c5. There's also an interesting line that's related, and that's bishop b4 check, c3, bishop c5. Black gives up a tempo in order to entice white's pawn to c3, and this is actually an interesting line if you want to look at something kind of unexplored. Another point too is bishop d2, queen e7 actually wins a pawn for black because both e4 and d4 are hanging. So this is an interesting line. But we're going to focus on one of the two main lines, and that's bishop c5, which is consistent with a lot of the other systems that I've looked at here on chesslecture.com. Just a nice classical rapid development for black. Now here the main continuations are bishop e3 and knight takes c6. Today we're going to focus on knight takes c6, which I think is the most annoying move. And next time we will look at bishop e3, and also we will peek at some less common moves like knight f5 and knight to b3. But knight takes c6. Now, the right move for black here is queen to f6, a nice in-between move threatening mate. If dc, white simply trades queens, and not only have we had to move our king, but white has a very healthy 4 versus 3 majority on the king's side. bc is also possible, but after white just say develops like knight c3, knight f6 can be met by e5, which is a little annoying. So this quickly developing with queen f6 is considered the best continuation. Now the main line is queen d2, which is kind of an awkward move, but it protects f2 without blocking white's king bishop. It does block white's queen bishop, but white also has ideas like maybe playing queen f4, queen g5 to trade queens. There's another line that's played sometimes now that I think is kind of silly in a way, and that's queen f3, forcing a queen trade, and after queen f3, gf3, bc is the correct response. Both sides kind of have defects in their pawn structure. White doesn't have a typical kingside majority because because black is taken with a b pawn. But this is just kind of an unclear ending. After bishop e3, the best move is to actually take on e3, bishop e3, fe, and follow with like knight e7 and castles and f5. Recent game at the Olympiad in Turin continued here, rook b8. This was a game between Zhang and Akopian. And black won this game. It's just, black's not better, it's just kind of an unclear ending, but it's really nothing to be too afraid of. I think white has just started playing queen f3 a little bit just to avoid theory, but it shouldn't be too dangerous. So the main move is queen d2. And now we're going to play d takes c6. B takes c6 is also playable, leading to murky positions, and this would be something to consider maybe as like a secondary weapon. It's an interesting idea, but its theoretical reputation is second to d takes c6. So if we look at this position, it doesn't look like too much is going on. White's advantage here, which is typical in the Scotch, is he has a healthier pawn structure and a potential endgame advantage with 4 versus 3 on the king side. Now, what Black has going for him is it's very easy to develop. Black is already, very comfortable in development and has an open d-file. And after knight c3, a lot of moves have been tried here. First, bishop e6 was the main line, after which White usually continues with Kasparov's move, knight a4. And this leads to complications that lately have seemed to favor White. After bishop d4, bishop d3. So we're going to look at two other continuations. One is pretty solid and one's a little unexplored. First, we'll look at the solid continuation, which is knight e7. This has kind of been the most popular move at a high level for the last few years, and some consider that bishop c5 on move 4 is actually the reason that you don't see the Scotch so much now. So after knight e7, White generally plays queen f4 to get queens off. Other options are to play like knight a4, but here Black can just simply play bishop d6, and after bishop d3, knight g6. If White insists on trading queens with queen g5, we play knight f4. The key for Black in the line in the bishop c5 Scotch is to develop very actively and use piece play, because White has the better pawn structure. Now this is also a typical idea, allowing, after like bishop f4, queen f6, gf, this is a very typical idea, allowing the doubling of the pawns here. And it looks ugly, but there's a couple reasons for it. One, Black has another open line in the g-file, and a possible break to fight for the initiative with f5. And also, the doubled pawns actually make it a little harder for White to create a passed pawn. With like a normal pawn structure like this, the 4 versus 3 here, White can always create a passed e-pawn. But in this structure, it's a little harder. So the doubled pawn sometimes makes it a little harder for White in the ending. So we'll see this theme come up sometimes. So that ending here, after bishop f4, queen f6, gf, is unclear. I think most top players would prefer Black here with the 2 bishops over White's better pawn structure. It really looks so much better, but it's really hard to do anything with it, and Black has 2 bishops and open lines for his rooks. So knight a4 is not so dangerous, and the main move is queen f4. So after queen f4, Black generally plays bishop e6. Queen e6 has been played too, which sacrifices the c-pawn. But that's a little speculative. We're going to look at the main continuation. Now White can't take on c7 because f2 is hanging. So after bishop e6, queen f6, gf, Black is very active, ready to play castles long, and either rook g8 or rook to e8. So usually White tries to distract Black by playing knight a4. And then we play this move, bishop b4 check. Now if bishop to d2, bishop d2, king d2, castles check, bishop d3, and Black can either play a typical pawn structure here with like b6, something like rook e1, c5, and then knight c6. With a good pawn structure, Black's putting all his pawns on dark squares over here because he has light squared bishop. And Black can also try to play actively with something like f5 here. The disadvantage here is that after the exchange of these 2 pawns, White again has a 3 versus 2 majority that might be a little easier to create a passed pawn in the ending. But this is still a ways off, and Black is very active, so it's usually not so easy for White to do this. And so we just have to remember to stay active. Now, the more natural move for White is c3, and then after bishop d6, Black is already threatening b5. And after bishop e3, covering the c5 square, b6. A couple games have gone f4, castles long, king f2. White is just trying to kind of consolidate and catch up in development. c5, c4. White will have to play this eventually just because this knight on a4. And now knight c6. And already we can see that black has some pressure in the center. And after knight c3, f5, this position has occurred a couple of times. If e takes f5, bishop takes f5, followed by like rook h to e8 is very active for black. And a few years back, Kramnik actually had this position against Deep Fritz, and white played e5. And Kramnik played a clever move here. He played bishop f8. If bishop e7, white can play knight d5, and after bishop d5, cd, the f-pawn ends up being quite weak after like knight b4, a3, knight d5, bishop d3, and white will win the f-pawn back with probably a small advantage. So Kramnik's idea here is to play bishop f8, and now if knight d5, we can do bishop d5, cd, knight e7, which both attacks d5 and protects f5. So we're ready to play rook takes d5, and if bishop c4, knight takes d5, then we can go back to e7. So when Kramnik had this position against Deep Fritz, the computer played b3, and after knight b4, a3, knight c2, rook c1, knight e3, king e3, bishop g7, and black is all set to play f6 and rook e8 with two great bishops and pressure in the center. So white tried knight d5, and then Kramnik played c6, knight f6, takes, and rook h8, and again with great pressure in the center because white is lagging in development, and Kramnik eventually rounded up this f6 pawn and won a long ending. So this line knight e7 is very solid for black. It's a little dry, you get to these endings, but you just have to remember to stay active because white does have the better pawn structure, but black has a nice development lead and chances for active play. So now we're going to peek at a more modern continuation, which is much less explored, and black has scored very well with this line. And that is this very funny move, 7, bishop d4. It's funny, this is almost a preemptive move against knight a4, because black could just play b5 right away. There's a couple ideas here too, like if knight a4 anyway, black can actually just play a6, and then the knight on a4 looks stupid because c3, bishop a7. You know, in the old line bishop e6, this wasn't really a possibility because bishop a6, knight a4 already created some issues for black. So the main move is bishop d3. White can also play bishop c4, and then after knight h6, h3 to stop knight g4, bishop e6, bishop takes e6, fe is a very clever idea. Black creates the f7 square for his knight, and despite the kind of defects in his pawn structure, black has a nice development and can castle and play rook a d8 and is very active. So bishop c4 isn't so popular. So now we look at the main move. Bishop d3, knight e7. Here knight h6 could be met by h3, and this knight doesn't have much of a future. So black is going to play knight e7. And after castles, knight g6. And there's a couple ideas for white here. Knight e2 can be played, just hitting the bishop right away, and then just simply bishop e6, followed by knight e5. Knight e5 to g4 is like one of the main ideas for black here, really disturbing white. Sometimes if h3 and h5 can be played, sometimes black can just take on d3. It's kind of funny, black spends a lot of moves moving this knight around, but it tends to really disturb white. King h1 has also been played here. And f2, knight d1, which is kind of a normal move here. And then after queen d6, already white is kind of annoyed here. If g3, then h5, and if f4, then a typical tactic, knight takes f2, is basically a draw. After king f2, queen h6 check, king g3, queen g6 check, with a draw, because of course king f3, queen g4 is mate. So typical little harassment tactics from black. So the latest try for white is to play 10 queen e1, which is a logical move. It gets out of the way of the bishop, and really white would like to just play bishop e3 to trade off one of the bishops. So after knight e2, bishop e2, now white's ready to play king h1 and f4. A few moves have been tried here. I like just castles here. There's some other ideas if you like to kind of play creatively. You can play g5 to secure the f4 square. There's a logical move, of course not without risk. And black could also play h5. The idea of this move is that when white has to eventually do king h1 to play f4, f4 can be met by knight g4, and h3 will not chase the knight away. So you could play h5 with the idea like bishop e6 and castles. But what happens if black just plays normally with castles? This is a very good answer. After king h1, black can still play knight g4. And it's not so easy for white to untangle here. If h3, we can play queen h4. If f3, then knight e3 is annoying. And if f4, again, knight takes h2, and black can make a draw. So a logical way for white to play is to get rid of this knight finally with bishop g4, and play bishop e3 to trade off this strong bishop. But now black can just play bishop takes c3, and probably white's best is to actually trade queens with queen c3, bc, and just go into this ending. This is the kind of ending I like to play with both sides, rooks and opposite bishops, and both sides have some defects in the pawn structure. White has a majority that seems a little easier to use, but black can play b6 and c5, and white has certain weaknesses on the queen side too. So if we go back here, we'll see black has a couple of good moves, and I think this is one of the reasons that you don't see the Scotch so often now at a high level, is that even though the most natural move, bishop e6, is not played so much, black has held equality in the ending with knight e7, and also the unexplored continuation, bishop d4, is scored quite well for black. So this pretty much solves knight takes c6 for us. The main thing to remember is to stay active, because white does have the better pawn structure. But as typical in the open games, piece play is paramount, so that's the main thing to remember. Now next time we will look at the other continuations for white, which I don't think are quite as annoying, and that's bishop e3, knight b3, and the rather dubious knight f5. So we will take a look at those and the Scotch Part 2, and until then, thank you again for joining us on chesslecture.com.